do forgive me, cliche alert, but there isn't any other words I can actually which work to describe what I mean. Glen Ivey, for me, is an unsung hero within the Democratic Party for the simple reason he does the hard work again and again. And he's not somebody you always see all over cable news. He's not somebody you see screeching in a tweet or something on social media. He is just somebody who delivers. Put a few bits and pieces together. We'll start with how he reacts to the crazy impeachment of Mayorkas. For me, this is what a representative should be doing. Not going on some ego trip, not going on some whingy, whiny, making silly clips for social media, but doing the job he was elected to do, to represent the people and speak up for those who don't have a voice and make sure it's always about facts, truth, and the issues that count.
Mr. Speaker, here we go again. Not even a week after my Republican colleagues failed to advance their unconstitutional impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas, House Republicans again put critical House business on hold while they wasted precious time on another meaningless impeachment vote. Mr. Speaker, the list of things this House majority has ignored is long and only getting longer. House Republicans have failed to pass the key bills needed to avoid a government shutdown on March. Congress still needs to reauthorize the FAA bill to improve air travel and safety. We need to reauthorize FISA to bolster our national security. House Republicans need to provide critical military aid to our allies in Ukraine and Israel. And the civilians in Gaza and Ukraine need life-saving humanitarian aid as soon as possible. House Republicans can't pass or haven't passed any of these critical bills. I'm calling on my House Republican colleagues to get serious and to let us get back to doing the work the American people need us to get done. Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Professor Turley, let me come back to you, and I thought I'd pulled up your testimony here, but it goes to the question I raised when I was making my opening statement, which was that you'd raised the issue. Oh, I'm sorry, it's page 18 of your testimony. Disinformation does cause divisions, but the solution is not to embrace government-sponsored, government corporate censorship, I'm sorry. So what would be the types of solutions we're looking at? And I'll just, off Dr. Miller-Idris's statement, for example, a new phenomenon apparently is people, I guess when I was a kid, you know, they would pull the fire alarm. Now they're making calls and saying that there's an active shooter at elementary school X. And because of the networking that everything has now, that gets picked up by the police and EMT and frightened parents, news media, even though it's false. So one example, I mean, there's multiple others. We could talk about the recruitment videos and the like, and you might have gradations of those, but I mean, what would be your take on how we should be addressing these kinds of issues?
Thank you very much for that question. I actually think there is a lot of common ground there in terms of what we can do positively to deal with disinformation. Disinformation is a real thing. It is a thing that people go on the internet. It seems to be a license for people, and in an age of rage, that license can be truly horrific when you look at how people transform themselves on the internet. What I would stress is that the government should not be in the business of censorship. That's a bright line that the government can live with. Instead, it should focus on producing better information and to have offices that can counter. Because remember, the courts have accepted that, the Supreme Court has said the government doesn't have to be neutral on information. When it speaks, it's allowed to take a side. It's allowed to say what it believes is true.
Well, but let's follow up on that. So I, as government official, learned that there's no active shooter at that elementary school. And I've, call YouTube, Twitter, whoever, and say, hey, look, that's false information. You're scaring parents to death. Can you take that down?
Well, first of all, that example you gave may indeed be a crime under state law to make false claims of that kind with the purpose of triggering panic. But more importantly, one of the things that can be done is that the social media companies and the government can immediately flag information they believe is untrue and speak in their own voice. What I think we need to develop, and I think there's a lot of room there to develop it, is to try to create better guardrails that keeps the U.S. government on this side of censorship, and that includes the use of agencies, the use of private companies, in my view, do trigger the First Amendment. I think that the government has actually violated First Amendment.
Since I'm running out of time, there was something else I wanted to raise. I'll have to come back to you all in the next round. You did mention Nina Jankowicz in your statement, who I had a chance to meet during a deposition in the Judiciary Committee, and I've started following her and what happened with respect to her. She was the person, as you may recall, who was appointed to head that board. As it turned out, she was essentially forced out of the position before it was even formed. And I'll offer a couple of articles here that can be put into the record, but there's an individual named Jack Posobiec, I guess his name is, who put out arguably false information about her that got picked up by Chairman Jordan and others. Actually, I think Ms. Taylor Greene had some comments with respect to it. We can put them in the record. I think Mr. Gates did as well. That sort of escalated into her getting death threats. She had to hire a security company. She was 8 months pregnant.
Parliamentary question, Mr. Chairman.
I didn't say that you...
He mentioned my name and accused me of saying false information about Nina Jankowicz.
Committee will be, the committee will be at ease.
Can we pause the clock?
Yeah, please do. In fact, put 20 seconds back on the clock, please.
Yeah.
Committee will suspend. Members are reminded not to engage in personalities, and the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. But members of Congress made comments about her that took on a life of their own. They became viral on the internet, led to the death threats that she got, and still gets, actually, even though she's been out of the position for about a year at least. And I think she's filing a lawsuit against Fox for propagating these stories as well. But you know, she was clearly a victim of, in my view, misinformation, disinformation. You know, and from her perspective, it was very ironic because that's what she was actually brought into the government to try and address. So I'll come back to it later, but thank you, Professor Turley, for your comments.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Ivey of Maryland for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you all for coming today. Just briefly, I wanted to respond to the comment about legislation sitting on Senator Schumer's desk. You know, with respect to H.R. 2, I think it was clear before it was passed, frankly, as it came through the committee here. Democrats offered amendments, all of which were rejected. Republicans put in poison pill language, especially with respect to not only abortion on some of these bills, but cutting off federal funding to agencies and, you know, social support groups like Red Cross, Catholic Church, and the like. So the fact that you sent it over there knowing it was DOA, I think, is not much to praise for the effort. But more importantly, although Speaker Johnson sent all of us home 3 weeks early, the Senate stayed, and the Democrats and Republicans were actually working on bipartisan legislation to try and address the border crisis, working with the White House and, yes, Secretary Mayorkas to try and find an agreement. Meanwhile, the House Republicans, instead of working with that group and joining in those negotiations, did a road trip to Texas for a photo op opportunity to talk about the issues at the border. So if we want to get serious about it, oh, and by the way, President Biden sent supplemental legislation, man, I think it was in September for additional funding. No response from the Republican colleagues. So if you can, part of that's what's one of the minor things addressed in this article behind me, worst Congress ever, that goes to the ineffectiveness of this Congress under the House Republican leadership to get anything done that's critical. We've probably gone through the issues of pending legislation, Israel, Ukraine, FISA, all the things that haven't got done that need to get done. The border's another one. I hope my Republican colleagues will get busy on that. With respect to the actual issue of impeachment from a legal standpoint, I went through the testimony that the generals provided. I only saw 2 paragraphs in all 3 of your testimony with respect to that, and none of it actually spoke to the language in the Constitution with respect to treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. And I thought that was interesting. Professor Turley, who is not necessarily my favorite, but Republicans seem to like him. He testifies a lot. In fact, at the opening hearing for the impeachment hearings against Joseph Biden, the Oversight Committee leadership called 3 experts to testify. Turley was one of the 3. And one of the things Turley said, like he's saying here, is that there's no basis for impeachment. His taking this position with respect to Secretary Mayorkas, and the fact that none of the witnesses that have been called today by the Republicans actually have that kind of experience with respect to impeachment and expertise, and I thought was interesting. I'll add this too. You can put it down. We want to add to the record a couple of documents. One is the Turley letter, which I'll offer in a moment. But the second is a letter, an op-ed that was written by Joshua Matz and Norm Eisen, who are former members of the House Judiciary Committee who've actually worked on impeachment hearings before. And they talked about the absence of evidence to support impeachment here. And a couple of respects that I think are important that we go through. One is the issue of maladministration. So the framers, when they put the provision, and they went through different iterations of it, but they ended up with the language they've got, but excluded a term like maladministration so that we wouldn't have impeachment hearings for policy differences. Because, and this is James Madison, if we did that, the Senate could be picking and choosing and throwing out people just on policy disagreements, where really that we should leave that to the president. The president gets to make a selection, pick his cabinet or her cabinet, hopefully one day, and make the decisions on who should be ruling there. The issue here, and that's pointed out in the Eisen letter, and with respect to the group of professors led by Lawrence Tribe and others who point this out, this is just a maladministration dispute. My colleagues over here are talking about the borders run amok and all of that, and I hear that point, but that's just a policy difference. In the testimony that was given, points about bribery, treason, crime, high crimes, and misdemeanors don't seem to have been made. There's no legal violation, there's no criminal act, there's no basis that the framers were looking for to remove a cabinet member from office. That's a very serious step. And by the way, I got a printout of all of the impeachment legislation that my colleagues have put together. I think Ms. Taylor Greene alone just has 8 impeachment resolutions in this Congress. 8. 3, I think, against Secretary Mayorkas. So if we're going to be serious about this, let's try and get to the issues with respect to the actual legal piece. And I apologize, Mr. Chairman, but I'll conclude there. And I look forward to actually having a debate and experts who can speak to this from expertise or scholarship on the issue of the standard for impeachment.
The gentleman yields.
Until it's my turn, then I'm going to run over to.
Wait till it gets into this 5 minutes, yeah.
Gentlemen's time is about ready to start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, I appreciate you coming in today. I saw a characterization of this hearing as a GOP-FBI grudge match, but I must say that the only grudge that's been seen here is from the Republican side. I think you've done an outstanding job with your testimony today, even when you've been, admitting that there are shortcomings by your office, that mistakes have been made. I appreciate the fact that you are willing to do that, because it's not easy for agency heads to do that, and also, more importantly, to point out the changes that you've made to try and address those concerns. I want to say this too. There's a couple points that have been made here about, you were just talking about the Foreign Influence Task Force. And I know there's a lot of talk about this as being some kind of prior restraint or First Amendment violation, but I want to say that I'm on the side that thinks this is a very important tool for the FBI and the United States government to have, especially with respect to potential intervention or interference, especially by Russian state actors with respect to American elections. There's some people who think, and I'm kind of starting to agree, that one of the reasons some of my colleagues are pushing so hard against this and other aspects of information protection within the United States is because they want to have Russian interference in the 2024 election.
Oh, please.
I certainly don't. So I certainly thank you for continuing your efforts on that front. There was an issue that was raised about whistleblowers earlier in the hearing, and I wanted to bring this up. I know you can't speak to this, Mr. Director, but these are two checks that were written to some of these witnesses, two of the witnesses that testified here, and they are for over $250,000. Now, they came after they gave their testimony, I think by a few days, but from my perspective, this is something that the American public should know when they evaluate the testimony of these individuals. And hopefully I don't know if the majority knew about this but didn't disclose it at the time or what was going on with it, but in my book, this really brings the credibility of these witnesses' testimony into question. And I think we should keep this in mind when we evaluate the allegations that they've made. I also want to say this too. My Republican colleagues have come a long ways from the law and order days of the Republican Party back when I was a kid. Now we're at defund the FBI. I think one of them selling T-shirts to try and raise money using that slogan. Another colleague is talking about abolish the ATF. Another one wants to say defund the Department of Justice. But as you mentioned in your testimony earlier, the FBI is doing a lot of great work protecting the country from terrorism, foreign intelligence threats, international cartels. There's weapons of mass destruction that you mentioned in your testimony. I appreciate that. And also, there's been a great deal of talk about the domestic terror threats. For me, the planned attempt to kidnap the governor of Michigan and apparently kill her was chilling to the extreme, and I appreciate the fact that you all were able to intervene on that. I want to say this quickly too. I'm running short on time, but the misinformation and weaponization claims that have been made by my Republican colleagues, I want to offer these two articles. One is called by Aaron Blake of the Washington Post, "All the Ways Trump, Not His Foes, Sought to Weaponize the Government." And then another one, this is Philip Bump. This is on the Missouri v. Biden case, which was quoted extensively at the beginning of the hearing, a deeply ironic reinforcement of right-wing information. The point of this article is that the Missouri v. Biden decision, which, and I know you can't comment on it because it's pending litigation, but I also think it's being challenged by the Department of Justice, and rightly so, because it's riddled with factual inaccuracies and legal inaccuracies as well. One other article for the record, this is by Lee Littman and Lawrence Tribe. Restricting the government for speaking to tech will spread disinformation and harm democracy. I'd like all of those admitted. And then lastly, with respect to the Hunter Biden issue, there's a letter from Abby Lowell, who represents Mr. Biden. This is to Representative Jason Smith, but I think also to Chairman Jordan as well, that raises the pushback on the allegations. That points out that the investigation began during the Republican Trump administration, was supervised by 2 Republican attorneys general, was carried over by a holdover Republican U.S. attorney. Last point I want to make, I promise I won't run over my time much. I happen to represent the district where we contain 2 of the sites where the FBI headquarters could be moved to. The chairman made a reference to maybe not wanting to fund the move, but I must say, I think I had an office near your building. They've got nets around it to keep parts of the building from falling down and hurting pedestrians. The move is important, and also would give you a chance to consolidate. Hopefully you'll bring it to Prince George's County. We'll save $1 billion for the taxpayers. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Back Gates first.
Thank the gentleman for yielding, Mr. Chairman. I think what we just observed was a drive-by committee presence from the gentlelady from Missouri. And what I would reflect on is that if someone is the victim of an armed robbery, they don't need a green space. They need a local government willing to fund their local police department. If someone is about to be stabbed, as one of the witnesses was at our field hearing in New York, they don't need a therapist. They need force to be able to respond back, and they need the law on their side, which is why I've introduced a national stand your ground bill that I believe the committee ought to hear. And if your car's being broken into, you don't need wraparound services. You need a detective. Day in and day out, people in the communities run by Democrats feel less safe. And the reason they feel less safe is because they don't feel like the law is on their side. And by the way, funding up the FBI and the ATF and the censorship industrial complex at the DHS isn't what they need. It's local police, and those are the folks whose backs we have and who you all have spent years denigrating.
Will gentleman yield?
Gentleman's time has expired. Does the gentleman wish to speak on the bill, or we got an amendment coming? I'll recognize if you.
I appreciate it, Mr.
All right.
Chairman. I just want to say this. I think the rhetoric's over the top down there. I was a prosecutor for 12 years. I've been endorsed by the FOP every time I've run for office. People in my jurisdiction, by the way, don't want to get rid of the FBI and the ATF. They're very glad that we have them. When I was a prosecutor, we coordinated our prosecutions with them. It's called Project Exile. I believe it was started by the Bush administration, by the way. But we tried to do that to get gun offenders off the streets and to make sure that serial offenders got more jail time because they got more serious sentences in the federal courts. The FBI and the ATF led those efforts in those prosecutions. And by the way, the Sinaloa cartel takedown that just happened 2 weeks ago, there were no local police involved with that. You know why? They don't have jurisdiction to do it. FBI, ATF, Homeland Security, all were involved in those in that takedown. When you guys complain about not doing enough to stop fentanyl, guess who it is working it? It's FBI, it's ATF, it's DEA, all these federal agencies that you want to get rid of. We need them to do that work. I think we also need the local police to do the work too. And if you find some place where Glen Ivey said defund the police, I'd love to see it. But I think we need both. I'm glad that you all see the need to have, I think I'm hearing today, federal law enforcement handle cases as well. We need the Department of Justice, we need the FBI, we need the ATF, we need the DEA. We need help from all of them to deal with the major international problems that we've got going. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes himself. Yield to the gentleman from Florida.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I wouldn't want anyone in the minority on the committee to be of the view that we think that every single Democrat holds the defund the police view. Matter of fact, we don't think that, and I think the gentleman was correct in referencing we've got Democrats who've been a part of keeping our community safe, and we thank you for that. You're patriots for offering to do that. But when the Democratic Party elevates to the position of chair of the crime subcommittee, the very leader of the defund police movement, you don't have to be for the defund police movement to be supportive of, I think, some pretty dangerous platforming of ideas that make people in our communities less safe. And there's been much discussion of these crime rates. And what I've noticed is that in some places, the crime rate may be higher in red places because those crimes are actually acknowledged practically with arrests and criminal process, where in a lot of places like New York, things like shoplifting aren't even a crime anymore.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
I would.
Would you agree that it's helpful to have the FBI, the ATF, the DEA, and the Department of Justice to prosecute federal crimes? Would you think it's a good idea to keep them around?
Just as you've not called to defund the local police, I haven't called to completely defund the FBI. What I've said is if they don't come to heel and if they are not responsive and constrained by their authorities, because Mr. Ivey, I think it is fair.
Gentleman from Florida controls time.
I think it is fair to be critical of an ATF that imposes zero tolerance on people, and then they lose their own guns. They keep records in the hundreds of thousands they're not
Would the
supposed to
gentleman
keep,
yield?
and then they don't.
I just want to ask about your legislation.
Yeah,
Because your legislation is one line,
Yeah.
and all it says is, we're going to shut down the ATF. It doesn't say anything about all of the other stuff you just mentioned.
Well, that's
All
because
it
I was
does is
talking
it
about
says
the
we're gonna shut it
FBI.
down.
As to the ATF, I would invite your co-sponsorship to that legislation.
I think it's crazy. Why would you want to defund the ATF?
Because the ATF has so greatly exceeded their authority, they are punishing regular Americans with no basis and soaked in the hypocrisy of seizing documents and holding records that even the Department of Justice, the vaulted Department of Justice that you talk about, their own Inspector General is hammering the ATF. And so that's why I think they maybe need a shot across the bow. But the folks out in our communities that are battling against
Actually, the time belongs to me. I've yielded to the gentleman.
The folks that are out in our communities, like the witnesses at our field hearing, they count on a cop in their community, and they count on a local government able, willing, determined to fund those local cops. And you heard from an investigator that represented a lot of the detectives out of New York tell you how the advocacy of these policies, which I certainly would agree, not every Democrat holds, but your leadership.
Would the gentleman
seems to
yield for a
embrace it.
moment?
Certainly.
Okay, so your bill, which you just called a shot across the bow,
Correct.
defund ATF, you think that's a good message to law enforcement?
I think it's a good message to the folks at ATF who are breaking the law.
Well, I tell you what, let's target them. I don't think you have to shut down hold on. You don't have to shut down the whole agency to address any bad apples. That's the same thing with police departments
But similarly,
at the
Mr.
local
Ivey,
level.
but similarly,
That's
you
what
don't have to
IGs are
maintain
for.
the entire agency to do the things that you've talked about regarding the Sinaloa cartel. Just as you may suggest, not every single person at the ATF is a bad person, and I don't think they are. I don't think you need to keep the entire apparatus either. So yes, on the continuum of the ATF, I believe they have done more harm than good when it comes to people's civil liberties, and when it comes to some of these other federal agencies, they do need to come to heel. So that, by the way, Democrats used to believe in civil liberties. You guys used to actually think that when government overreached and violated people's constitutional rights, there was a bad thing.
I must say, we still do. We still do.
So long as these federal agencies will go after Trump and Republicans, they seem to get a lot more attention from you.
I got to say, I've been at this a lot longer than when Trump was president. And we've been able to challenge the FBI, the ATF. I've been on both sides of this. When they cross the line, you prosecute them, you fire them, you deal with
But
that.
see, all we could do is defund them.
But saying you're going to shut the whole thing down.
Our power is the power of the purse, and we have to be able to use it. And that way, if you've been on both sides of this issue...
Did you send a letter to the IG saying you need to target these bad apples in particular?
We send so many letters to the IG highlighting the things that we're finding in our investigations. And if you've been on both sides, what I would say is, what are you waiting for to get back on our side, on the correct side?
I'm waiting to get back on the majority so we can actually focus on laws
when you were in the majority,
that
you guys
deal
didn't
with
do
gun
anything
violence
to protect people's rights.
and bring down the gun
these
violence.
agencies with
by
all
the
the
way-
powers that they've now weaponized against the people.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much. I've got an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
I don't get it. I really don't. There's no plan A, there's no plan B, there's no real agenda short of being Trump's ASSWIPE, Speaker Johnson. What is Speaker Johnson up to? It doesn't matter whether it's on the border, it doesn't matter whether it's on Mayorkas, it doesn't matter whether it's on foreign aid. It's just, what a total... I can't even think of an insult. Somebody please help me. Give me a one word that describes Speaker Johnson. No ambition, no charisma, pretends he's on the phone whenever there's an interview going on, and clearly, when he's speaking, he's just regurgitating somebody else's words. Something tells me he can't even, this is somebody who wouldn't even know how to brush his own teeth. Do you do the left, brush, brush? Do you do the right, brush, brush? Clueless, literally clueless. You know, if you were in traffic and you saw Mike Johnson driving, you'd pull over, you'd give him a wide berth. That guy he's not even a fruitcake, not even a nut job, not even a total loon. How has it happened somebody with such little self-qualification become Speaker? Please, in one word, describe Mike Johnson.